Welcome to Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. I'm Spencer Critchley, and I'm joined this time by Mike Madrid.
Great to be with the both of you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It's great to have you, Mike, and Zach Friend.
It's great to see you again, Spencer and Mike. Looking forward to the conversation.
The first thing I want to ask you both is, looking at the media coverage of the 2024 election so far, what do you see as being done wrong or done right? Or what are the gaps in particular that we might try to fill? Mike, let's start with you.
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that the nature of media, the nature of coverage has really changed. It's been changing. That's not atypical. But we used to look, for example, at the European model and say a lot of their news outlets are much more partisan than ours were. We kind of had these three objective news sources that would kind of bring people to a common discussion of what the issues actually were. Today, we're not only not talking about the same issues, there's obviously this enormous partisan bias based off of which platform you're consuming your news from. And unfortunately, I've found the best way to get objective news about what's happening in the United States is now to go to European news sources, ironically enough, to find out what is objective news here, people with a little bit less bias, because it's so difficult to kind of discern some of the elements of what's happening from a partisan perspective. So look, and I don't know if there's any way out of that at the moment. I think that until there is an appetite for objective news and somebody can figure out a way to monetize that, we're stuck kind of in this doom loop for the foreseeable future. In fact, it's getting much worse. You're seeing layoffs at the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Messenger completely imploded. The legacy media, as it's called, is kind of going away. And understanding that, I think, gets to the kind of the peanut of the question here, which is, what is that creating? What kind of vacuums opening up as a result of that? What are we no longer covering? And that's to me, that's the real danger, is when we have people who are watching Fox News and think that is one, actual news, or two, that it's objective, unbiased information that they're consuming. People on the MSNBC side don't realize they're doing the exact same thing. Cable news is not news. They're not trying to hide that. And I'm sure that will upset some of your viewers by saying, no, this is the truth and this is objectivity. No, it's truly not. If you're consuming cable news, you're missing 80% of what in-depth, deep, knowledgeable news coverage was. You've bought into an anger machine that is driving your own outrage, your own fears, as a way of algorithmically connecting you to their screen to make money off of it. That's how they've decided to monetize that venue, and that's all three of the major networks. It's the only way that they're surviving, and two of the three aren't doing a good job of it. But that ultimately becomes the problem, I think, that needs to be addressed. And again, Spencer, I think that's what you're asking, which is there's no longer these policy discussions or long-form investigative understandings of what is happening on a policy front. We don't have policy discussions anymore in a real meaningful way. This is really truly about, kind of culture war. And so we fight more about Taylor Swift than we do about, the situation in Ukraine. And we can argue that that's kind of where the people are at, where the public is at, and there's a lot of truth to that, but there's a certain leadership, certain obligation that's required of an institution like the media to establish that as primacy, is what are the issues. And again, I'm taking this back to the CBS, NBC, ABC days, right, when there were only three talking heads, usually some older white male guys, no offense, fellas, but that were just kind of talking and telling us what the news.
Well, I'm especially offended, Zach. You only zing Zach with one of those.
He's got the best hair, though. I mean, of all of us that would make it on NBC as an anchor, it would be Zach. So we've got to remind ourselves of that. But they would not just provide the news; they would also tell us what the news of the day was. And there's a lot of trust that goes on in that as an institution. As we just believe that what we were being told was what we should be focused on, and then here's objectively the facts and information, kind of make your judgments from there. What that provided was a common understanding as a people, Republican, Democrat, men, women, old, young, black, white, brown, whatever. We had a common agreement on what the topics facing the nation were for that day. That no longer exists. And until there is something that can bring us around this common campfire to have these discussions, the chances of further balkanization, I think, are much, much greater than they are less.
Yeah, I'd love to do a whole episode just about that. I do the same thing, Mike. I'll put up that screen where you can watch 5 or 6 different networks at once. And one of them will be the BBC, and it's fascinating to watch BBC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and just notice just the visual difference of what's coming in, and then tune into the BBC coverage. I do the same thing when I'm looking for something that will feel...
Yeah, I think the best way to answer that question for Americans to understand what's wrong with American media is to watch the BBC. Just to see how much we've changed. Like we're like a sports thing. There's the running chyron. There's the comments on the side. There's the fight on screen between panelists. It's all designed to hyper stimulate us as an algorithmic way to keep us engaged on that screen. And the BBC doesn't do that. I mean, I'm not saying that alone makes it better news, but at least it tells you what the objective is of that platform.
Well, and of course, there's a couple of issues here. I mean, in the world of Fox News, well, all of them, all the commercial media are facing this pressure you described, where they have to draw viewers, or else they go out of business, no matter what their intentions. But then there's also, there's a whole rising opinion, especially on the sort of academic left, that there's no such thing as objectivity, and all news should have a political viewpoint, otherwise it is false. The pretense of objectivity is falsehood, and this is the sort of thing that could easily occupy a whole episode. But I agree that while of course objectivity, there's no such thing as perfect objectivity, there is such a thing as a meeting place where we agree to discuss things based on evidence and logic. So we can have arguments, but we agree to the rules of the game, recognizing none of us knows the truth with any absolute certainty, but we can agree not to say things that are false. If we make an argument, to cite evidence that can be checked and try to connect our arguments with logic, and that's kind of the essence of the public square. But as I say, we could do a whole episode about that. Zach, what's your quick take on what's being missed right now in the coverage of the 2024 election?
Context. I think that to Mike's point, what they're focusing on is traditional, the horse race. I mean, it's every day it's a new poll, but there's no context as to why we're getting the numbers that we're getting. And the whole thing now, that's driving its own narrative, becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy with people. And to Mike's point that we're covering the culture war and not the policy, the irony is that the culture war is actually driving the policy. So Ukraine is being driven by Taylor Swift discussions and what tribal team you're actually on. So they are closely aligned, even though they're not necessarily viewed that way, because you end up in a very tribal context. I know that, Spencer, you basically wrote a book on this whole subject to some degree, but to me, the context really matters. You can't just throw numbers out there about how Biden and Trump are doing in Wisconsin without having an understanding of the sample size, where the political attitudes are right now, et cetera. But there's no context being provided at all.
There's something that I think about quite a lot, and I've written about it a little bit, is the infantilization of Americans through having this intensely marketing saturated economy, including in the media, where essentially the customer is always right, and you're just looking for whichever customer niche you're serving. And so you must keep them interested, you must keep them entertained, as if they're kind of princes and princesses at court who must not be bored at all costs. And so I think this is part of what leads to the trivialization of news. Everything must be entertaining. I think Mike mentioned a lot of it is so much like sports coverage. And I agree with both of you on this score that you have very, very serious issues at stake that literally affect people's lives. I mean, there are literal life and death decisions being made in electing these leaders. And it's treated as if it's, an episode of American Idol or whatever, because that's what it has to compete with, and the sheer triviality. And I don't think this is true of all the coverage. I think that what gets lost is there are a lot of really intelligent, thoughtful people making commentary on TV every single day. It's just that the overall impression that I think most people get is not that. It's extremely trivial.
Let me ask a question of you, Spencer, and actually Mike on this end. if one of these networks were to make a decision, an editorial decision to really drive true policy discussion. I mean, let's just say that they Fox News or MSNBC tomorrow started having much more in-depth looks at policy, less culture war stuff. Would their viewers actually shift opinion, or would they just
I think they tune out.
Revolt?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a good argument. I agree. I think they would tune out, but the question to me is why, right? Like the PBS NewsHour still does this. Now, there's a nonprofit model, and we're seeing that in traditional journalism too, where we are actually getting, like Cal Matters, for example, here in California, does an exceptional job of doing long-form journalism. They've got 70 writers, 70 reporters on staff, and they're going to be hiring more. At the same time, you're seeing a collapse of an institution in the Los Angeles Times, like literally in the same month. So the question we've got to ask ourselves is, are we trying to monetize objective news in a way that no longer works? The answer, I think, is undeniably yes. That doesn't mean that there isn't a need for it in a society, a democratic society, small d, democratic society. It's one of the pillars of what makes a democratic society work, but we can't expect somebody to be making money off of it. I mean, as long as there's a nonprofit model that can work, and it seems to be those are emerging, we may look back at the last 250 years of history and say, how did we allow private enterprise and for-profit, models for news? And obviously there's a First Amendment reason, but like William Randolph Hearst was not a good guy. Right, that's how the Spanish-American War started. Right, the yellow journalism it's basically fake news. We called it yellow journalism. Rupert Murdoch isn't an American and not a good guy. Right, running Fox News. Like there's the for-profitization of news. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but that may have been a bigger danger to democracy and society all along. I'm not saying it shouldn't exist. I'm saying if we're going to have a public square, we should have a truly public square, not like an Elon Musk version of Twitter X, but something that there's no profit incentive or motive or controlled by any one entity and or person or a party's agenda. It's a true public square. And I think that model is emerging.
If it can survive, there's certainly some nonprofit news organizations, including at the local level, actually including where I am right now in the Monterey Bay Area in California. But I don't think it's established yet whether that's going to be scalable and work nationally. This raises key questions within the American context about First Amendment and free markets that make this a very hard sell, although it didn't used to be. As you say, Mike, when there used to be this CBS, NBC, ABC news model, those news divisions lost money, and lost money proudly. But that was partly because of stricter regulation of the public airwaves back then, and the story since then has been a much more free market with deregulation, especially during the 90s, during the Clinton administration. And a lot of people thought, well, this will be great because it'll democratize everything, reduce the centralized control over the news, and, let 1,000 flowers bloom, etc. I think I'm quoting Mao there. That's not somebody I ever like to quote. But you get the idea. But the trouble is, instead, what we've seen is what we've seen, where people just micro-target their audiences and feed them whatever they want. And in the case of some of these outlets, it's just whatever lie they want to be told. As we've seen from their internal emails, they're fully aware of what they're doing. They just figure out what lies people want to be told, and they tell them those lies. I agree that it could work better. At the moment, I'm not optimistic we're going to get there anytime soon, partly because of how entrenched this view of the free market approach to broadcasting is, and how addictive it is to get your news the way we get it. Sometimes I do the experiment of switching from one of the cable news channels to PBS NewsHour, for example, or when I go back to Canada, where I was born and spent much of my life, and watch Canadian news. And even I, who am hungry for substance in the news, find it hard to watch because it's not stimulating enough, which I think is an indication of just how addictive it is when you're constantly being hit with all that stimulation.
Well, it's like buying, anything in a neon package at the convenience store, and it explodes your taste buds because it's designed to, and then going back and eating broccoli and going, well, this is boring. Yeah, well, but it's good for you, right? Like that's the way it's designed to be run. Yeah, it's a hard sell, but well, not for me, but I mean for a lot of people, right? Like I'm a voracious consumer of news, especially political news, but I don't have a cable TV subscription. Why? Because that's not news. Like you just said, watching these different news sources, it's not news. Like Fox News does not claim to be. They call themselves Fox News, but they'll say we're not journalists. It's literal. They're pretty upfront about it.
When they're in a court of law, when
no,
they're required to tell the truth.
No, that's not accurate. No. Sean Hannity will say I'm not a journalist. Rachel Maddow will say Maddow will say the same thing. These are not journalists. Yeah. They're commentators.
And a lot of people in the public can't tell the difference.
No, they can tell the difference. They don't care anymore because they're so so addicted to it.
And as I say, a lot of this is the overall packaging and impression. So, I actually think MSNBC, for example, if I run down the list of MSNBC contributors, I think most of them are excellent. I think most of the hosts are really intelligent and really well informed. But the overall, and I know that they don't intentionally say things that aren't true, and if they say something that's not true, they'll correct it. But the trouble is the overall packaging and impression you get is, oh my God, Trump is so awful, which I agree with. Tell me how awful you think Trump is. And while, I might find that sort of fun, it's not particularly informative. I'd like to narrow in a little bit on some of the specific issues in this campaign and whether they're being covered right or not, or whether we think the candidates are addressing these issues well or not. And Mike, since you're one of the country's top experts on Latino voting, and you've been writing about this recently, I've seen pieces by you in the New York Times and the LA Times, for example. I'd like to ask you for your perspective on the Latino population of voters, as well as the issue of immigration. The Republicans have long been demagoguing this issue, and in my opinion, exploiting the usual, bigotry, fear, and hatred. But there is an issue there. And meanwhile, of course, Biden is having to deal with this issue because there clearly is something happening at the border that needs to be addressed. Mike, could you give me your sense of, let's start with Biden. What's the challenge he's facing, and how well do you think he and the Democrats are addressing that challenge so far?
Well, and let me kind of set the table a little bit differently here. There's no question that the Republicans have been demagoguing this issue for the past 30 years, since the mid-1990s here in California. But I also want to make this very clear. The Democrats have had no interest in solving this problem for their own prurient political benefit. That is just quantifiable fact. They've had many opportunities, both in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, to solve this problem when they enjoyed support in both houses. There's a reason why they haven't solved this problem. The Democrats I'm speaking about. And keep in mind, Barack Obama deported more people than all other presidents in the history of the Republic combined. Okay? Barack Obama. Joe Biden has waived 23 environmental laws to build a border wall at a faster pace than Donald Trump. So depending on which media you're consuming, the language of how this is framed is biased towards a direction that says, the Republicans are horrible on this. I tend to believe that they are, but I also don't believe the Democrats are that much better. In fact, they've been, in many ways, much more to the right of Republicans when they've had the actual opportunity to run from an executive branch the border. So the fact that Democrats have not, to this point, done anything on this issue forces the question, why? Why not? The answer is because it's politically benefited them with the growing Latino vote. Now, there's a demographic reason for why both sides are in flux right now, okay? Where we're at is the actual Latino vote has changed demographically, mathematically. In 2007, right before the big economic crash, we saw a virtual collapse in immigration levels that lasted until 2020, 13 years of declining immigration. And so the only people that were screaming about immigration at that time were Fox News Republicans talking about caravans and trying to manufacture an issue where it didn't exist. The problem is it really does exist now. There is a crisis, and I'm using that word methodically, consciously, and I think accurately, at the border, at the southern border right now. And that crisis is exacerbated by the fact that domestically, the Latino voter, which is now overwhelmingly U.S. born, 50% of the fastest growing segment of voters, Latino voters, voted in their first election in 2016 or more recently. They've only voted very, very young vote. And those numbers are starting to get very big. But these voters are not Spanish speaking. They're not foreign born. They're not naturalized. They're U.S. born, largely non-college educated, but increasingly more college educated, upwardly mobile, aspirational. And their voting behaviors, at least from polling and results in the last few election cycles, demonstrate their views and attitudes on immigration are not that different from non-Hispanic whites. In fact, they're only slightly marginally less motivated by the issue than whites are. So that's a real conundrum for the Democrats. And you're starting to see that in Washington, realizing everything that we have stereotypically built around this narrative of who Latino voters are is proving untrue. It's not what the story is. Now, you're seeing right-wing, people caricaturizing it too, and the hypocrisy of the right is predicated on the idea that, oh yeah, we're winning more and more Latino voters. Yeah, we're winning even half of the Latino voters, as Donald Trump will say, and yet they don't want more of these voters coming in. And of course, undocumented people can't vote anyway. So the Republicans are kind of lying on both sides of this. I'm not saying these guys are good actors in this, quite the contrary. But the conundrum, and I wrote this in the New York Times piece, is that in order for Joe Biden to fix the problem he has both with Latino voters and with his weak numbers in the middle, is to come and triangulate the way Bill Clinton did on this and crime issues in the mid-1990s. Come and seize the issue, seize the narrative from Trump and the Republicans, fix the border. There's nothing racist about fixing the border. I mean, I have to say that, but you have to say that in these times and days. There's nothing wrong with fixing your border, as long as you're not using, some of the horrific language that Republicans are using. It's not a policy problem here. It's a tenor, language, tone problem. And one of the challenges I've always had as a Republican Latino is agreeing with some of these folks that we need to fix the border, because I know that why I want to fix the border is so very different than why so many other, Republicans want to fix the border. But nevertheless, the border does need to be secured. And what the awkwardness with which Biden finds himself right now, because his coalitions have convinced themselves over the past 25 years that this is a bedrock, foundational, fundamental issue for Latino voters, despite the fact that Democrats have been losing Latino voters since the 2016 election. 4 of the last 4 elections have not been good for Democrats with Latinos. They're losing more and more voters every year, and the reason is because they keep speaking to Latinos as if they just arrived yesterday, and are you appeal to them in Univision, and you talk about immigration issues, and we're all farm workers. That stereotype worked for a time in the mid-1990s, but what worked in the last century isn't working in this century, and the Democratic Party has to develop a more prospective, aspirational, middle-class message than it has in the past few years, and that, in a nutshell, is what is causing the Democratic Party to lose working-class voters. Is the Democratic Party is really not a working class party anymore. They very much view themselves as like a party of FDR. They're not. And that's not Mike Madrid saying that. That's working class voters saying that. Like they don't believe that the Democratic Party is the party of the working man anymore.
Zach, how do you see that from the point of view of somebody who's been involved in Democratic politics at the national, state, and local level, and especially in the communications aspect of it? You're intimately familiar with this kind of issue. How's it look to you?
Well, I think that a lot of what Mike is saying is true, because all you have to do is look to when Democrats have been successful over the last 30 years. And as you know, Spencer, doing communications for then Senator Obama and then President Obama, the reality was there was a very different position on this that actually, I think, aligns with Democratic Party values. It focused on dreamers, and it focused on aspirational messages. It also focused on a secure border. John Kerry said it. I mean, if you think about some of the elections, this is what we did. And Joe Biden has been historically pretty moderate on a lot of issues. I think that the border being one of them, I think his policies have actually, interestingly, probably been about as progressive as any president in modern history, the things he's been able to get done. But my sense would be that absent this noise, this sort of the noise of the ecosystem that both parties are operating in, I would imagine that the president's approach would actually be pretty balanced on this if he wasn't getting a lot of other, and actually some of the approaches he's taken in the last couple of weeks have shown that. I also think that this is an issue that shows how much an issue can be elevated through a media ecosystem, because I think at the end of the day, this isn't the number one issue facing the country. I mean, it really isn't. There's a lot of other challenges, just like people feel the economy is terrible, and none of the numbers actually seem to show that right now. So the otherization that's successful through media ecosystems has really exploded this into the general construct. And while there's clear issues, and by the way, there's clear humanitarian issues that's also leading to the border crisis. I mean, part of this discussion is also not talked about the investment in other countries and things that we used to do historically that are also leading to these challenges. But I think that at the end of the day, neither party can be driven by the 8% of their members, that exist on the extremes, both in the House or mainly in the House, I would say, that are driving everything. I mean, from Republicans being inability to keep a speaker because they've got a couple members that are going to be wild about it, and the Democrats on the same thing when it comes to issues like this. If you're not even willing to have a discussion about this, when most of your voters are interested in you having a discussion about this, I think that you do have an issue from a communications perspective. I mean, it'd be fascinating to me to hear whether Mike would get a hearing in the current campaign structure on the Democratic side, right? I mean, how would this message be received by the Biden campaign or the DNC would sort of be an interesting point, because I think that above all, everybody's greatest fear on the Democratic side is another term of Donald Trump, and who has, now that he actually has some level of understanding of what the levers of the presidency can do, I think would be completely untethered. I mean, he was barely tethered previously, but I think he'd be completely untethered. And I think that ensuring that there isn't a second term should be more important than any other issue that the Democrats take on right now. And I think they should be open to these uncomfortable discussions that I think Mike's presenting.
Yeah, this is often described as the vibes aspect these days of politics, right? Which I think is a kind of a trivial word for a very serious issue. And this turns out to be, I guess, a theme of what we're talking about here. Because I think from the Democratic Party's point of view, talking about immigration and Latinos, I agree with Mike that so much of it is based on these stereotypes, which were stereotypes to begin with, but are now outdated stereotypes. And I believe the intention to treat everybody with equal justice and respect is sincere. But of course, it comes across as a form of bigotry, a kind of unconscious bigotry where you haven't really bothered to meet these folks and learn about them as individual human beings, and address them the same way you would. With all too often, we're talking about white people, and this is just a characteristic of human nature. People assume that people like them are normal people, and see them as fully three-dimensional beings, and have a hard time seeing other people as anything other than types. But if you're in politics, you absolutely have to do that. You actually have to meet people and meet them as individuals. So this is the vibes thing, right? So I think that Democrats often panic anytime something like social justice in any aspect comes up, because they're afraid of basically how it's going to look or feel if they actually address it as a nuanced, complicated issue. If they recognize Latinos, for example, as rising working class, middle class, and the wealthy class in many cases, and having a whole variety of priorities that have to be addressed, not just assume, as Mike says, that all they care about is making sure that immigrants are treated well coming across the border. All of us should care about that. But it requires getting beyond this kind of vibes-oriented, how does this feel in the media sort of approach to all of this stuff. I think crime is similar. The Republican Party has for, well, decades now, since the 60s really, sold rising crime very effectively to their voters and have them in a constant panic about crime. And it's no accident, of course, that when you watch the crawls on the right-wing networks, the crime you're seeing is black and brown people ransacking stores, right? Or, black neighborhoods in flames and that sort of thing. And that's going on like 24 hours a day. In fact, violent crime has been declining since the early 90s. It spiked during the COVID pandemic, but it's been dropping dramatically again. That doesn't mean there is no crime problem, and there certainly are local crime problems across the country in blue and red areas. But this is another one. How do you folks see this crime issue being covered?
Well, I mean, look, it's treated very cosmetically, right? It doesn't get to the root cause of what we're actually talking about. So, like in a state like California, which Gavin Newsom would suggest, is posting safer crime statistic numbers than a state like Florida and or Texas. Technically true. I mean, he's right. But when you look at things like homelessness, where homelessness has just exploded in California in a way that is showing that government doesn't have the ability to actually manage what the problem is at the state or local level. You have to understand that the voters' impressions of going out and seeing tents on their sidewalks constantly leads to fears of crime. And I'm not saying that's rational or that it's evidence-based, but it's absolutely true, right? People just don't feel as safe. And there's probably a human biological reason for that. And so, as a political consultant, whenever you're looking at stats or data or evidence, trying to argue that in the face of where voter sentiment is usually a losing strategy. People don't need much, they're not going to be comforted or cajoled by data and stats when they don't feel a certain way. You're witnessing this right now with consumer confidence, which is just now beginning to come back, right? People are saying they don't have confidence in this Biden economy, and the Biden administration is going, wait a second, look at every metric. We're just crushing it. And they are. The numbers are astonishing. The employment numbers are coming way up. GDP growth is just off the charts. But people are going, wait a second, it cost me $30 to go out and buy, like a hamburger and a Coke with me and my kid. Like, how is that normal? Like, that's the affordability question is a problem. And that's what I'm saying. If you're arguing stats in an upstream battle against where reality is, that in a nutshell explains why we're seeing some of the polling challenges that we're seeing for the president right now. I'm not saying they aren't correctable. I think they actually very much are. But I would say the same thing for crime. Is people don't view, they're looking around their reality every day of what they're seeing. And when you start to see things in your community that don't look right, that don't look okay, that make you feel unsafe, that's far more impactful than saying, well, at least we're not, as unsafe as Texas is, right? Like that's not the way voter psychology works, nor should it be. And so the crime issue is the one issue that truly swings back and forth. We go through these periods of like 3 strikes, lock them all up, throw them in private prisons. And then, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years later, it'll be like, hey, these cops have gotten kind of out of control. Like there's a problem here that we need to look at. Let's put body cams on police. They're beating people up. We're seeing it, especially with people of color. There's something's not right here, and now I think you're starting to swing it back. Where the knee-jerk response to that is defund the police messaging that was coming out. Such a problem that Joe Biden had to go to the well and during the State of the Union and say no. But you're seeing that shift coming back to more of a tough on crime approach, and so it's a little bit too. It's accurate to say there's been this. Conflagration of news out there that shows black and brown faces looting and showing this stuff both on social media and on some cable news shows that have a nefarious agenda trying to drive this stuff for sure. But there's also some rationale for it that we've got to be mindful of and say, wait a second, voter opinion does matter on this. Public perception really matters a lot more than facts in politics. And the perception right now is things are not good. And we've got to ask ourselves why. And it's a little lazy to just say, oh, that's just because of Fox News. When you can walk out your front door and step over 3 or 4 people's tents and saying, this is not that big of a deal. It is a big deal. It's a very, very big problem that California has a particularly pernicious problem with. I'm not saying it's not everywhere, but it is exponentially greater here than anywhere else in the country.
It can certainly be really bad, and just in my own experience going to San Francisco, it's terrible because San Francisco is a wonderful city, and to know it is to love it, basically, and yet it is in really serious trouble right now. I would argue in many cases because liberals have not been enacting liberal policies. But Zach, how does it look to you in terms of addressing this crime issue, and in particular addressing this big gulf between what might be demonstrable with facts and figures, but yet is in conflict either with people's daily experience or the experience that's created for them in the media they consume?
Well, Spencer, as you and Mike know, I was in this space pretty intimately for a long time, working for a law enforcement agency and doing a lot of national work in this space. And one thing that always struck me was how emotional crime is. Even when you dealt with the data, as Mike is noting, it was really irrelevant because at the end of the day, when my mom had her car broken into, and I mean, they just rifled through, took some change that was in there, but she felt violated for years after that. I mean, her whole sense of place and security. And then if you are seeing things on the streets that make you feel uncomfortable, or you're watching something on television that's saying that places are being looted, it really helps create a narrative around this emotional space that's very powerful, that I think is actually much larger than crime. And I think that in particular, the conservative media ecosystem, and I respect Mike saying that the blame on Fox News on this one, but I think that they've been very successful in being able to create a picture that the general sense of place has been disrupted in modern American society. Crime, religion, identity, right? These kinds of issues where you're talking about book bans and whether or not people are able to freely be religious, and the crime. What that is, these are little stars in a constellation of trying to create this general narrative, right? That our way of life, whatever that means, is under attack, this historic way. And immigration plays into this, by the way, and our way of, and so we need to restore that sense of order. And when you are arguing on a more nuanced position, that's a very difficult place to be. And crime, I think, is it actually impacts all of these elements because of that emotional resonance. I will say that as somebody who ran for office, right, immediately preceding, as a Democrat, immediately preceding my time in law enforcement, I was not dinged by functionally any of the Democrats in my district or countywide for having that background. I think this perception that everything needs to be massive reforms on, not to say there isn't systemic, there's all these systemic issues associated with it. I'm not questioning that. But the idea that you need to have 15 propositions removing everything from being a crime, for example, is not actually in line with how people think on the streets. And I feel like on the Democratic side, as somebody, again, I wasn't running away from my law enforcement background. I was literally the face of a local law enforcement agency, so I couldn't. I won overwhelmingly, right? Multiple times. And I think that that's where we're missing the point. I think that that's a very small extrapolation of how people view the immigration issue, how they've on and on and on, that people actually want both, right? They want to be able to say that, well, I want to feel secure in my house and I want law enforcement to be accountable, right? I want to be able to have a secure border and I want a pathway for dreamers, right? This is not a challenging thing to message. And for whatever reason, though, we've created a zero-sum messaging internally, right? Here's the irony. I think the American public would understand if you were to say that we want both of these things. The minute you say the first part of it, though, you get attacked by a very small minority of your own party, and it actually drowns out the ability to have the second part of the discussion. But anyway, I think that the crime element is a microcosm of this broader issue of this sense of loss of place that's very important right now in the broader political discussion.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about this a lot right now. It's the subject of a lot of my writing right now, is the idea that essentially it feels to people like reality is breaking down. Their world is falling apart because in a way it is. The shared worldview we used to inhabit is breaking down. Now, the reason that worldview was shared for a long time was it was essentially a white male Western European worldview that was sort of the default worldview in the United States. And now, as we try to become a truly pluralistic democracy, that worldview is going to experience a lot of stress. I think I hear both of you saying, though, we have to have a worldview. We have to have some kind of shared worldview. That doesn't mean that everybody has to sign up for the same religion or the same political ideology. But somehow we have to find a meeting place where that sense of community can be restored. Now, Zach, you wrote a book about this called On Message, which focuses on narrative, the importance of narrative, and you were just alluding to that. Do you have any thoughts? I know you've advised a lot of big corporations and nonprofit organizations about this. Do you have any thoughts about how, say, the Biden campaign could apply this to trying to restore that shared sense of a community where we can come together? And I think all three of us agree that's not going to happen by trotting out all the statistics on crime or the statistics on immigration or statistics on how, as Mike says, the economy is actually doing amazingly well. That's going to have to be some kind of narrative, right, Zach? How do you look at that?
Well, look, as the great Ron Fauché used to say, if you remember him from the political campaign strategy world from 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you can't govern if you don't win. Right, and I think at the end of the day, the president needs to recognize where his coalition is to getting reelected, and then he can be the adult in the room on the governance side. So this concept to me, he still has a very strong narrative of most of the country as being an inherently decent person, and all the attacks on him otherwise are people that aren't going to vote for him anyway. I mean, at the end, you have to be willing to discount the reality, or not discount, but just discount in your mind the fact that. We don't need to pursue folks that are never persuadable anymore. The idea that there's this large, independent, persuadable bloc is a myth. And I think that where we are is hyper locked in. Polarized is a word, but I think we're just hyper tribal in our position. I mean, I could ask you a question on this of what Joe Biden would have to do for me or you, Spencer, in particular, to not vote for him. And I actually literally can't think of a thing in exchange, for voting for Donald Trump. I mean, there's literally nothing. And that's what people that are Donald Trump supporters think about him, as evidenced, right, by everything he's done. So from a narrative perspective, I think that what he just needs to do, and it's pretty prescriptive, I would say, is find the coalition that's necessary to win and message the hell or out of that specific coalition that's needed, and that's the narrative, because he has what I think got him elected in 2020, other than this overall sense of just people wanted the chaos to end, was this overarching sense of decency that they felt that he could bring to the overall process. So he's got that strong narrative. I think what I would do if I was on his campaign, I would bring him to every storm-ravaged location in America, no matter where it is, red or blue right now, and show his empathy in the way that it really plays up very well. I would also, on a policy side, be doing the things Mike's talking about. At the end of the day, this is going to be decided by 20,000 votes in Wisconsin and 15,000 votes in Georgia and however many thousand in Arizona, and you've got to get there. And you've got to figure out what it takes to actually get there. That the idea of a Barack Obama meta-narrative in this campaign is not real. I think that we've lost to some degree the ability to have somebody come in and have red and blue states all uniting. I think we're not there in 2024. We may be there at some point in the future. But absent a uniting event, Spencer, in the country, like a war or something that, where we're literally, I'm not asking for this, but I'm saying that tends to be, you have these 9/11s or these kinds of macro level issues that actually do unite a country or break through the noise. Absent that, I think that he needs to be very prescriptive in his narrative to make sure he gets the votes that he needs to win.
And that leads me to the campaigns. How do we feel about how each campaign is addressing this challenge? Heading towards November. Mike, what's your take on that for both campaigns?
I think all of your listeners ought to replay what Zach just said a few times and really kind of soak that in, because I think it was very elegantly put, and I think he's absolutely right. There's both this tactical element, which is the question you're asking, and this broader thematic, and whether that's even possible in modern American political discourses. Does the mythology of America still work when half of us don't buy it or believe in something totally different, or we have two very different worldviews of what America is? Like, can we reconcile that short of a civil war? We have been, at this point in our history, a couple of times. The Civil War, of course, the most pronounced, where there's just no reconciling the different worldviews that we have, and it devolves into violence. And both of you guys have used different word, pluralism, I think, and tribalism. One of the most fascinating things in researching this book that I just wrote was the question: what is the difference between pluralism and tribalism? And the answer is perspective. They're defined almost exactly the same way. It's just one is a more optimistic, confident view of a diverse society, which is pluralism. The other one is more defensive and insular and isolationist and frightened, and that's tribalism. But they're essentially the same word with a different perspective. And America at this moment is debating: are we going to be a truly pluralistic society that is true to our founding mythology? We were never that country, by the way, right? But our mythology, right? This arc of progress that King and Obama talked about. Like, can we be that? And we have always struggled mightily with that, because the idea of America in many ways is in conflict with basic biology and 99% of human history, which is you have a strongman, you have a dictator, you have a fascist, you have a tribal chieftain, you've got a leader. And this American experiment is predicated on the idea that we can kind of somehow transcend that if we all share a common mythology, a belief in the fact that we are all somehow endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? And then this contraption of a balance of powers and constitutional republic comes into play. That's all predicated on the belief that we all buy into the mythology, by the way. Once that goes away, well, you're kind of in America 2024. And so this is a long windup, so I will answer the question. But Biden actually said this and recognized this in his inaugural address, where he said, we need to bring enough Americans along with us, not all Americans at this point in time. He's very methodical in his word choice, because to Zach's point, we're not going to convince half of America that is full-blown MAGA and would rather tear it down and commit insurrection than see a transfer of power. Stop trying to convince those people. They are a threat to the republic, and they need to be responded to appropriately, because if we don't, our appeasement with those forces is going to drive us to a very dark place. What Biden's argument is we need to bring enough Americans along with us to continue down this road and keep this House united. And that gets to the tactical elements, which I'm convinced, as long as he shares that positive, optimistic, pluralistic American mythology, there are enough Americans that are buying into that. In fact, 3 of the last 3 national elections suggest there are even enough Republicans buying into that. And as long as that continues, not a lot, 9, 10, 12% of Republicans that are shifting over and saying, I'm done with the Republican Party. I don't like the Democrats. I don't like Joe Biden, but I'm an American, and we can get past bad policy. We can't get past, a dictator. That's the rationale for, a wide swath of Republicans, or enough of a swath of Republicans. That's enough to carry the day. And that is this moment in history, in American history, is can we continue that arc? Can we get there? And to me, that vision is accomplished by being more centrist on policy, which is why I'm making this claim for border security. Look, when I look at Joe Biden, I see 2 things. First is I see a president who's been more conservative to the right on oil extraction and energy extraction than any president in American history. Okay? I see a president who is united like a neoconservative, the global forces for good, and been far more interventionist in foreign policy than probably any Republican in my entire life. I see a president who's to the right of Donald Trump on the border. Like this is, one, it's good governance, but 2, if we're honestly looking at Joe Biden, he's as much a Reagan Republican as a Reagan Republican could get or could be. And while that may sit uncomfortable with a lot of Democrats, write it out and look at it objectively. That's what's happening.
And at the same time, I would argue he's also, and I'm not disputing your points there, but I think at the same time, and I think this is also actually part of your point, he's an FDR Democrat in many ways. He's the most pro-union, pro-worker, sort of traditional blue-collar Democrat. Actually, first president in history to march on a picket line during the auto workers strike. And so he's kind of doing both of those things, also being very progressive on, green investments, for example.
Yeah, the American public is not responding that way, but he may be gesturing, but working people are not responding to him that way. That's a different question, though. My point is, my point, and Reagan got the UAW endorsement in '84, by the way, right? So the UAW has moved in different directions, but my point is we are seeing a very centrist, common sense, practical president who is saying, I will eschew the left when it makes sense. I will attack the right when it makes sense. And I'm not afraid to go to the center when it's the right thing to do on policy. That's what you need in a president. That's what you need in a president. And the last time we had a president like this, the last time we had a president who was dismissed as an old bumbling guy who was probably not supposed to be president of the United States, but found himself entirely rewiring the geopolitical structure of the world, was Harry Truman. And Truman comes into office completely underestimated, stares down the Stalinist threat in Europe, establishes Israel as a democracy in the Middle East, obviously, drops atomic bombs in the Asian theater. And we're witnessing right now that same constellation of events. Ukraine is in the midst of a hot war. There's an escalating conflict by design in the Middle East surrounding Israel. And the South China Sea is probably going to witness some sort of aggressive action in the next 6 to 8 months, or certainly before the election. Add to that, by the way, this fourth front, which is the domestic strife that is being exacerbated by our enemies. This is not organic entirely. Is a paid, sophisticated, organized foreign attack on our homeland. And that's where Joe Biden finds himself at this moment in history. And he's doing, I would argue, an exemplary job of balancing all of this with enormous stakes and enormous consequences.
Just for clarity, you're referring to like the organized social media misinformation campaigns being directed from Moscow, essentially.
Yeah. That's exactly right, and or Beijing, and or Iran. I mean, this is we are under siege. We are under attack right now.
It sounds like conspiracy thinking, but there's tons of evidence for this that's impossible to overlook.
Just from the basic evidence of the money that has moved, the millions that have moved through the NRA, the millions of money that have moved through Facebook, the millions of dollars that have moved in traceable dollars. We know it's to be true. So Russia interfered with our elections. There's just no debate about that. That's an act of war.
Now, I want to make sure that we have time to look at the Trump campaign too, Mike, and I want to ask Zach about both campaigns as well. I think that we all agree our most fervent hope is for the Trump campaign to fail miserably. But how do you see the Trump campaign performing so far, Mike?
It's much more sophisticated operation than it was in 2016. There's no question about that. They face much more significant barriers and boundaries. Look, when I founded the Lincoln Project 4 years ago this month, all of my data and analytics were showing that there were maybe 6% of Republicans who would break away from him and not vote for him. This is right as we were heading into the first impeachment, by the way, 4 years ago this month. Today, you start looking at the exit polling from Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina is going to tell us a lot. That number is 3 times as big. There's fully 15 to 20% of Republicans who are saying, no, I won't do it. And that's before, most of the legal problems that he faces come to bear. So I think that there's much more downward trajectory than upward for Trump. And I think the fundamentals of this race strongly lean towards a Biden reelection. Now, there are not going to be any landslide elections in this country for the foreseeable future, probably not in our lifetimes. So when I say a big win, I'm talking, 1996 numbers, maybe a 2012 number where a Democratic incumbent wins by a sizable number. It's not going to be 84 Reagan. Like it's not, Biden's not going to win 49 states. He should, but we're not. That's not where we're at, right? And so, yeah, Zach's right. This is going to come down to largely a few 100,000 voters, swing voters across 6 states that are going to be that are truly persuadable, that can make a difference out of 150 million votes cast. It's going to come down to literally both campaigns know who these people are, probably to the name, 150,000 voters across these states, and 20, 30,000 of them will make the difference in the Electoral College. So the margins are very, very narrow, as high as the stakes are. And tactically, I would say Trump walks in with some institutional strengths that he didn't have in a worse political climate than he has faced in both 16 and in 20.
Zach, how about your perspective on the Biden and Trump campaigns?
Well, first, Spencer, I'm looking forward to Mike's creation of the bumper sticker, Ronald Reagan would vote for Joe Biden. I think that's going to be a very popular seller online.
I'm going to tweet that today.
All right. And we'll make sure to connect you in with the leadership of the Biden campaign so you can get some T-shirts made and maybe help fund the book as it comes out. But I think that, I think that the Biden campaign is doing two things correctly. The first thing is they're using the power of the presidency to still let him be who he is. I mean, he's an empath. He's very empathetic, and he's out doing those kinds of things while they are also building up very strong teams in the key states that Mike is talking about, as well as in particular on the digital side where a lot of this information is going out. They're also putting together some of the players that were very successful both on the Obama side and the Biden side in the first campaign. So they're bringing back some of the people that really do know what they're doing in that space. I think the Trump campaign is they just seem more adult this time around, and their greatest asset is also their greatest hindrance, and that's their candidate, right? I mean, so this is somebody who has the ability to completely control the narrative, and he knows that, but he's also somebody who can't stay on script. I mean, if you just think about it from a fundamental standpoint, to Mike's point, this should be a much easier race than it almost seems surreal, right? I mean, if we were having this conversation about Barack Obama being indicted, impeached, and, literally convicted in a civil court, at least, of sexual assault and all these other things, I mean, this, right before his reelection, this wouldn't really be up for discussion, but the country has really shifted. And actually, fascinatingly enough, even members of my own family who are really kind of large consumers of the right-wing media ecosystem, they don't even know what I'm talking about on some of these issues. I mean, they're not even aware. I mean, legitimately. It's as though some of these things never even happen because they're not covered at all. Just like the most recent $80 million verdict wasn't covered on most of the ecosystem. So if that's where you're consuming stuff and you don't know, if you truly believe it's a witch hunt anyway, then it doesn't really matter. I just hope, I really just hope that the Biden campaign can do what they did in 2020, which is tune out the Twitter noise, right? And actually focus on what really matters in a few states and not be driven by this sense that in order to win, we need to grow a coalition that's broader or kind of an Obama coalition. By the way, the Obama coalition is also a little bit kind of romanticized. I mean, for example, Bill Clinton got more young voters in 1992 than Obama got in 2008. But yet, it's all these things that we've created these fantasies. But I'm ready to work. By the way, I mean I'm ready to get back on in some way on the campaign because I think it matters too much. I think that one thing I hope that your listeners really, if they care about democracy, this is probably the most important election that's going to occur in any of our lifetimes, and ensuring that they're willing to do something toward it is really important.
And potentially, worst case, last really legitimate election, if we don't rise to the challenge that history is presenting us with right now. I think I agree with both of you about the perspectives on both the campaigns. I'm nervous about how much more professional the Trump campaign is this time. I also just sort of have a feeling that we may see a total collapse of Trump sometime between now and Election Day. It could be a psychological collapse. I think he's under so much psychological stress right now as his malignant, narcissistic fantasy of himself is being attacked from so many different directions. We may actually see him have some kind of collapse. I just hope, and this is the sort of cynical political strategist speaking here, cynical in the cause of righteousness, I would say, though, that I hope that if that happens, it's after he gets the formal nomination of his party, because I think his party has to confront its complete moral collapse before it's ever going to move forward. Guys, it's great as usual talking with you both, and I know as usual we could go on a lot longer, and I hope to continue doing that offline and to get back together with you again online soon. As we wrap up, is there anything that I haven't asked either of you about that you'd just like to make sure you get across to listeners, who, by the way, I would say should give us hope as well? Like the listeners to a lot of other podcasts that try to go in depth on issues, I think they prove the case Mike was making at the beginning that there should be and may be a market for people who are actually hungry for substance delivered to them as if we assume they're adults. We certainly get that with our little audience. That's the response we get to our episodes. But anyway, just briefly in the time we have left, Mike, anything that you'd like to leave listeners with? And let's please mention the title of your book while we're at it, because it's coming up soon.
Well, yeah, it's the book will be out in June. I think you can start pre-ordering pretty quickly. The name of the book is The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. Simon & Schuster will be out in June. I'm going to come back, I think, and visit with your audience again. Spencer, before that's time, I appreciate all of what you're doing to have these discussions, because this is how change is really made. It's understanding the gravity, not only of the situation, but it's also being able to sort of transcend that fear, understand the root causes of it, and kind of push this American experiment, this American idea forward. This is how it's done. And so thank you for that. It's going to be a bumpy but interesting and consequential election year, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with both of you and with your audience as it unfolds.
Thank you, Mike. Same here. And Zach?
Just tune out the noise. I think that a lot of these ecosystems are designed to make you angry, fearful, or as some of the great Democratic strategists would say, to bedwet. Lots of bedwetting are going to be going on. People are seeing the polls and they're panicking, but that creates this inaction and this fear that can also impact elections. I mean, you've got, at the end of the day, the person that gets more votes in some of these key states is going to be the president of the United States, and just think about that and what you can do to help make sure that you have a role in ensuring that's what happens.
Wise words. Okay, thanks again to you both very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. Always a great conversation with you and Mike.